that I've gotten to attend more and different kinds of UU churches during COVID than I ever have before in my life. And it has been such a blessing. So this morning is Easter morning in the Christian tradition. And I wanted to open with a reading that is going to kind of set the tone for where we're headed this morning. And it is an adaptation of an excerpt taken from UU minister Charles Stevens from 2015. The resurrection metaphor continues to be significant for religious liberals. That is, when we remember that we do not need to take the story literally to convey its metaphorical truth. This spring, the cold of winter will be hard to forget. Violence and death continue to have a firm grip on our world. Feeling hopeless, be it repressed people in other lands or here in our own country, can cause people to lash out in violent ways. The resurrection story, as it is celebrated, is no longer primarily about new life 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. It is about finding life in each and every age amidst that which seems dead or hopeless. My message today is not that we should always look on the sunny side of life. That is not the message of the resurrection metaphor. Rather, the message is that even in the face of death, there can be the promise of life continuing. And the message of the resurrection is that regardless of the challenges or disappointments we face as individuals or community, there can be hope. About 12 years ago, my husband at the time joined the Navy, and our family moved to Groton, Connecticut. It took a few months to start getting to know people and build some friendships. Perhaps one of the most important relationships I developed was with a little Filipino man named Emmanuel. We called him Sensei. Sensei ran a small karate dojo in the edge of town, just a few minutes from my house. I was looking for something the kids and I could do together where we could meet people and it wasn't school related as my youngest wasn't in school yet. In addition to attending classes a few times a week, Sensei had what he called family night every other Friday night. Sometimes we would go to our local Chuck E. Cheese. Sometimes it was a Chinese buffet up the road. Sometimes it was barbecue in Sensei's backyard with his pool. Whatever it was we did, it was time for the whole family to spend together. The parents could interact with other adults and the kids could play and be kids. They became our family. My husband was away a lot. Excuse me. We were new to the military and so money was very tight. And Sensei took us in and made us family at a time when we needed it the most. He was also able to give me a discount on uniforms and classes, and he was able to do these things because the dojo was his passion, not his job. He was married to a prominent dentist in New London County, and he worked for the local power company by day. Sensei himself came from poverty and violence, and he moved away from the Philippines at a very young age. He tells the tale of how he was a hothead and always getting into trouble. He married a pretty young woman and had 2 children, and still it didn't mellow him out. He was spending money they didn't have. He had several affairs. He was angry at the world, he says. Then something life-changing happened to him. When his wife left him and took his children, she told him that he wasn't safe to be around. And she told him that their son wanted to take karate lessons and she had found a dojo to take them to. Sensei would be allowed to see his children while they were at lessons. He went and watched a few times. Then one night, he got angry at the kids' sensei. Now, at this point, he didn't have any karate training. It was just a little hot-headed scrapper. And the other sensei put him down on one knee without hurting him. It was in that moment, on his knee in front of his children and his ex-wife, that he came to understand how his actions affected other people and how it is possible to not react the way that he did. This other sensei could have really hurt him, but he didn't because his art taught him compassion and defense. This man chose to not get angry and fight back. My sensei was intrigued and he joined the class with his children. He very quickly rose through the ranks and became a 3rd-degree black belt. In addition to learning to channel his anger and other emotions through his martial arts, he found his way back to God. He was single through many of these learning years. He lived in a very poor part of New London County and walked through gang fights and muggings, rapes, and other such crimes every day on his way to and from work in his dojo. He usually quickly put an end to such activity, but it was apparent to him that this was all around and he wanted to do something. He started by putting together a program that he ran out of a local gym. He paid a monthly fee to be able to use the space, and a lot of times his students didn't pay anything. He tells the stories of various young men that would attempt to rob him or that he would see behaving poorly on the street, and he would antagonize them to get their attention. He would do to them that was done to him. He would swing, or they would swing, and he would put them down without hurting them. And eventually they would come to be students of his. Time passed and he had more paying students and no longer could stay in the space of the gym. They had outgrown that space. He got married and he got closer to God. Together they started this dojo that is now, and most of his students today are paying students, but he still leaves space available for low-income families and children in need. He starts every class with a Bible verse by asking his students, "Why are you here?" And the answer that we call back is, "To know oneself." And he says, "How? Not by might, not by spirit, or not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord." When I wrote this sermon, I was challenged to write something based on a biblical text that was assigned to us in one of my seminary classes. Not being primarily Christian, it was a little bit challenging. And so our professor said, "Why don't you see if you can find a theme?" As a Unitarian Universalist preacher, we sometimes have a daunting task of taking someone else's sacred text and making it accessible to the wonderful variety of beliefs that walk through our doors every week. So having never preached on the resurrection before, I decided to do a little research and see how other UU preachers spoke about the resurrection. Reverend Edgar Parra said, "No matter how many times truth is crushed to the earth, it always rises again." The Reverend Charles Stephen says, "The resurrection stories are the songs of the experience of a people who, having experienced grief and loss and disillusionment, felt a restoration of hope." The people of Jesus' time, the people that loved Jesus and followed him, were crushed and disillusioned. Their whole world fell apart as they watched their Lord and teacher die a cruel and horrible death. There was grief and certainly great loss. Friday faded into Saturday, and they were lost and alone. Then something happened. In between Friday and Sunday, something happened. Some believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead and walked the earth again. Some believe that the Spirit of Jesus showed himself to his followers for the express purpose of renewing their hope and letting them know that there was more. And we could argue all day, and some scholars and theologians do, about the truth of the story and how it actually all happened. But through all the arguing, the message remains. The message of the resurrection is that something good is possible on the other side of suffering. It was mid-April and the sun was shining. Spring in New England was an amazing time of year, almost as good as fall. My children were out playing in the front yard when all of a sudden I heard a commotion and went outside to see what was going on. There was a young couple walking down the street with their new puppy, Toby. Toby was a little Sheltie dog with long hair and more energy than could fit into his little body. My children had chased them up the road asking to pet their dog. I tell people my children accosted them one day in our front yard, and I'm sure glad that they did. We got to talking and I invited them over for our neighborhood bonfire that we were holding that evening. And that was the beginning of a friendship that is still strong and meaningful today. But there was so much more to their story, and I had no idea I would be a part of its unfolding. You see, Toby was a gift. They had only just gotten him a few days before that first walk down our street. The week before, Ricky had been in the hospital giving birth to a 27-week stillborn baby. The baby's umbilical cord had somehow gotten wrapped around her neck in utero and suffocated her. For 3 days, Ricky carried her stillborn in her belly before getting to see the doctor. She was young and 22, and they kept dismissing her, saying that she was being overly cautious. On day 3, someone finally listened. They had her in for an ultrasound and discovered that the baby had passed. She went home and showered and got clothes before the hour-long ride to the hospital where they would induce and deliver her. She had always wanted a puppy, so her husband Nathan brought her home Sweet Toby to give her someone to care for while she grieved. She attributes having Toby to care for to saving her life. The years that followed were filled with ups and downs for this young couple. Ricky barely remembered how to be a woman, let alone a wife. Nathan felt alone and alienated in the entire situation because he felt like his wife didn't really acknowledge his loss in the situation, and they drifted apart. At one point, Nathan had an affair, and it almost ended their marriage. Through the encouragement of his commanding officer, they went to couples counseling, and a year later had a healthy baby girl. But that wasn't the end of the story. Ricky was still in so much pain. Nathan was normally a very spiritual man, and Ricky was so angry at God, she couldn't even think about engaging in church or even any of the conversations. And when Nathan and I would have spiritual conversations, she would just leave. She wanted no part of it. When their daughter was about 1.5 years, he got out of the Navy and they moved back to North California, where they were from. Ricky thought this would magically fix her. She'd been so homesick since she'd lost their baby, but it didn't. Nothing she did helped. Then one day, as she was looking at her daughter and trying to muster the courage to get out of bed, she decided something had to change. She looked into the therapy and found an inpatient program facility in Southern California. And she made arrangements and left her daughter and husband while she embarked on the most courageous 30-day journey of her life. We didn't hear from her or see her the entire time she was there. She was allowed to call her husband and daughter once a week. Otherwise, there was no contact with the rest of the world. She spent 30 days focusing on herself and initiating her healing process. And she came out a different woman. She wasn't fixed. She wasn't even completely healed. But for the first time in years, she had hope. She started praying again and going to church again. She rebuilt a relationship with God and her husband. And today she is truly on the other side of suffering. And her life is good. She has a loving husband who's been blessed with a really good job and has been able to support their family so she can stay home with their daughter and new son. Reverend Carl Scoville said, "The resurrection comes with the recognition that any of our lives can always be transformed and begin again." It was about 2:30 a.m. on the morning of September 20th, 2010. Tom stood at the bottom of a ladder with firefighters on either side. He was about to climb up to the second story as he pulled him back to the ground. Then he looked up and saw the roof collapse into flames and engulf the house that he had lived in. He instinctively put his shirt over his face because he didn't want to inhale the ash. His son never made it out of the house, and he knew that his son's ashes were somewhere in that dark cloud raining down on them. His son's name was Alex, and he was 7 years old. Tom and Alex had also lived with Tom's girlfriend, who was not Alex's mom, and shortly after the fire, they had gotten married. Unfortunately, Tom spent much of his time in a haze, and very few vivid memories remain from the 2 years directly following Alex's death. As time passed, something inside him began to stir. He reconnected with an old friend who was recently divorced with 3 children. She was trying to help herself and her children heal from an abusive relationship. While Tom and his friend had always felt connected to each other, he still lived much of his life in fear. He was afraid to love, and he was afraid to feel much of anything, actually. But there was something rekindling in his soul. The more time he spent with his friend, the more he wanted to feel again, to live again. Tom came to the conclusion that getting married during such a stressful time was probably not a good idea, and he very courageously left his comfort zone. It took him almost 9 months to acclimate to his new life, and he and his girlfriend did end up getting together, or he and his friend did end up getting together, and 2 years after they moved in together, he's been able to open up his heart and love her and her children. He's been able to provide a strong and loving father figure and partner for a family that had only known betrayal and abuse. He still lives with fear every day, and he still lives with the loss of his own son every day. But he is surrounded by love, and he has allowed himself to love again. Reverend Robert Hardy said, "As I see it, my job is not to convince you that the resurrection happened, but to remind you that it happens. The way I look at it, each and every one of us in this room is proof positive of the resurrection. For whom among us doesn't have a story to tell, a very personal story of rebirth, of emerging from the tomb of depression or despair, pain or addiction? Who among us can't point to a time in our lives when all seemed lost, and then suddenly hope returned? I could tell story after resurrection story of souls that I've had the privilege to walk with on their journey. I could probably even add a few of my own. And I'm sure all of you have resurrection stories, stories of hope restored. But why do we share these stories? Why are they important? The story of Jesus' resurrection was so important that it was added to Scripture. We find similar stories in other faith traditions as well. That means that people from the beginning of time knew how important it was to share these stories. But one of the things I find interesting about these stories is the something that happened in between the loss and restoration. No one story comes to mind that really explains definitively what happens that causes hope to be restored. Sure, Jesus appeared to his people again, but no one knows for sure how that happened. It's part of the mystery, the meaning that we spend our whole lives looking for, only to come to the place where we realize we make our own meaning based on our own faith. And usually that place happens in between despair and resurrection. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that there are all kinds of faith. We believe that faith can be as simple as faith in humanity and each other. We also have Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, pagans, and many other faith traditions among us. But we all have one thing in common. We believe in something bigger than ourselves. And we share these stories to remind ourselves and each other that sometimes what looks like the end really isn't. What if Jesus' death on Friday wasn't all there was? What if the loss of that job is really a setting free to do what you're really called to do? What if that illness is the bridge to finally making that change and finding health? What if whatever you thought was the end of a story was really just a new beginning? One of the wonderful things about faith is that we have a choice. We have a choice on where the story ends. People of faith believe in resurrection stories. We believe that there can be hope on the other side of tragedy. And when people of faith walk side by side, believing and sharing, that story never ends with tragedy. Amen and blessed be.